Hey, Pastor Anthony here for the second installment of Sermon Snacks. This is the one on my sermon on Ecclesiastes 1:12 to 2:26. And the topic of that sermon was meaning. That was the one word. For each of the sermons, I'm using just one word to try to capture the main point and drive of the text. So our sermon snack today, just a couple things I want to look at in this text to kind of expand, to give you some behind-the-scenes kind of stuff that I was dealing with in the interpretation of the text, stuff that I could not bring out in the sermon. This is, again, we're in the kitchen, we're looking at the ingredients. Here's a couple of things. The first one is the issue of Solomon and Solomonic authorship of the book of Ecclesiastes. In my little introduction, I mentioned that the consensus, the overwhelming consensus of scholars, even in the evangelical world, is that Solomon was not the author of the book. There are a few that continue to maintain and argue that or defend that position, but most scholars are in the position of saying that Solomon was not the author. But in that first video, I didn't tell you why, what the arguments were back and forth on that. So I wanted to do that here because it comes up particularly in this passage. And I'll be using some of Richard Belcher. One of the commentaries I'm using on Ecclesiastes is by Richard P. Belcher Jr., and he's at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte. And he pastored an urban, non-denominational church in Rochester, New York for 10 years. That's my hometown here. I did not know that at all. Wish I would have crossed paths. Very good commentator. Used him on Job as well. Excellent. And so he talks about authorship issues in the beginning of his commentary and introduction. So where does this come up? Why would someone argue for Solomonic authorship? Well, here we go. Chapter 1, verse 1, the words of the teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Well, that certainly seems to fit Solomon, right? He's the son of David. He was a king in Jerusalem. So that's one argument. That's the first verse. Is this an identification of Solomon? But we have also there the words of the teacher, the way he identifies himself primarily as a teacher, as this one Kohelet that we've talked about. Can be translated preacher as well. But you have there the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So this is why some have taken it, or at least the historical position was for Solomonic authorship. Also in verse 12, which of course is the first verse of our text this past Sunday on this sermon, this is what it says. I, the teacher, again there's Kohelet, when king over Israel in Jerusalem, applied my mind to seek and to search out by wisdom. So again, this reference to being king over Israel in Jerusalem, isn't this clearly Solomon? You have a book of wisdom. Isn't this clearly about Solomon? And so we also have an argument for is what we talked about in the sermon. Isn't this descriptive, if you listen to the sermon on meaning, isn't this descriptive of a Solomonic search? That is what is described here is, and I made a reference to Ozymandias, this idea of this kind of great king, who did all these stuff. And, in chapter 2, he talks about, the wine and having a good time, right? But also about building things. I made great works, chapter 2, verse 4. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and of the provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and delights of the flesh, and many concubines. Sounds like Solomon to me, right? This is something easily that one could argue was within the nature of Solomon's rule, how he behaved, how he lived, the many wives, whatever. You can see this. So this is one of the reasons people have argued for Solomon. It seems to say it's Solomon, king over Jerusalem, son of David, and it seems to describe Solomon's lifestyle and his search, something consistent with who he was. Okay, those are our arguments for, but the arguments against really do outweigh them. Let's talk about them right here. So the first one is the perfect aspect of the verb to be. Sounds kind of crazy, but if you take it for a moment, verse 12, this is, of course, chapter 1, verse 12, which is the text we are looking at, beginning our text for the sermon. It says, I, the teacher, when king over Israel in Jerusalem. And the point here is simply this, that the reference is the use of this the perfect aspect of the verb to be. It indicates that the speaker, the author, the teacher of Ecclesiastes is describing a past, that he was once king and is not a king any longer, and he's looking back on that. And what that suggests is not Solomon so much as someone using a literary convention, taking on the persona of Solomon, kind of taking the life of Solomon as an author and looking back on that time of Solomon's reign or his experience, speaking from the perspective of one who is like Solomon. So it seems to indicate that kind of past tense use, that it's someone who's taking Solomon's persona, looking back on a time of Solomon's reign. And then there's also a second thing is chapter 1, verse 16, which says this is the teacher speaking, I said to myself, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. Now, what's the problem with that if it's Solomon writing this? Well, who was before Solomon, right? How many people were before Solomon, right? Not that many. Solomon, son of David, right? So it's who's he comparing himself to? It would be a pretty humble lot to do it. So it seems to not jive with the idea of comparing yourself to those who are before you. Again, I said to myself, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, right? It's like being in a class of 2 kids and you say, I'm top of the class, right? Not that great. Okay, so the third one is the non-Solomonic-like statements. What do I mean by that? That is statements that seem to be inconsistent with the authorship if it was Solomon being the author. Here's chapter 4, verse 1 through 3 as one example. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are practiced under the sun. Look, the tears of the oppressed, with no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors was power, with no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who have already died more fortunate than the living who are still alive, but better than both is the one who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. So here's the author complaining about the oppressed, and particularly the idea that there are these oppressors, there was power, and it just seems odd that if Solomon was writing this, first of all, he could have done something about this oppression because he was the big cheese, right? He would have been able to do that. And there's this critique of power, and it's like, it's hard to criticize the man, so to speak, if you are the man, and he would have been the man. So it seems inconsistent with Solomon. Another one is chapter 5, verses 8 through 9. And this is, of course, goes along with this argument that as you read the entirety of the book, it doesn't seem to hold up Solomonic authorship. So chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and right, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. But all things considered, this is an advantage for a land, a king for a plowed field. And so, again, here is this kind of statement of watching injustice, watching oppression, and, kind of protesting against it, against these officials, these authorities, higher authorities, this chain of command. Well, again, if it's Solomon writing it, he's the big cheese, he's the command. It doesn't seem to make sense that you be protesting against his own rule. And then finally, chapter 10, verse 20, which is perhaps my favorite in this list. If this is Solomon, would Solomon say this? Chapter 10, verse 20, do not curse the king even in your thoughts, or curse the rich even in your bedroom, for a bird of the air may carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. And Belcher notes this in the commentary on this. Ecclesiastes 10:20 assumes that the king is a suspicious bully. These statements seem to come from someone who is not a king. They could be made about Solomon, but not by Solomon. So that's the argument from those variety of statements there in the book, non-Solomonic-like statements. Okay, and then finally there's the issue of the Hebrew. And this argues really for a late dating of the book that makes Solomonic authorship unlikely. Belcher, quoting the great Old Testament scholar Delitzsch here in the book on the Hebrew here, if I can find it here real quick, right here. This is what Delitzsch stated about this. If the book of Kohelet were of old Solomonic origin, then there is no history of the Hebrew language. And so basically the argument here is if you look at the Hebrew of the book, it shows indicators of a later, more sophisticated, more varied development than one would expect if the authorship was Solomonic. So the Hebrew itself argues against Solomonic authorship. So there you go. You do have these things arguing for authorship, and that's pretty much the statement of him being the son of David, king over Jerusalem, of which Walter Kaiser, one of the evangelical scholars who argues for this is, he notes that Solomon was the only immediate son of David who was king over Israel, reigning in Jerusalem. That seems to coincide with chapter 1, verse 1. But when you take the whole picture of things and you really grasp what this is, whether it's the Hebrew, the statements, the totality of the book, who's he comparing himself to, and the idea of the literary convention being used here, which I am quite convinced that's what's going on in this text. Someone taking on the persona of a Solomon-like figure and looking at life through his eyes for rhetorical, for the purpose of making an argument in an entertaining and also instructive, wisdom-like way. Now, that leads us right into the next point I want to make, and that is the issue of literary genre. So particularly this section that I was dealing with. What is it? Well, Ellen Davis, who is a professor at this time, when she wrote this book, she was at the Episcopal Theological Seminary in Virginia, but I think she's at Duke. I could be wrong on that. But she's a well-known Old Testament scholar. She wrote a nice commentary on Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. She does great work on wisdom literature. By the way, she has a great little introduction to the Old Testament. I can't think of the name, but if you search it on Amazon, Ellen Davis, you'll see it's very, very well done. So she talks about this particular section demonstrating the literary genre of what is called an autobiographical memoir or a grave biography. That what you're looking at here is this form of literature, literary genre I should say, that was you would find in ancient Egypt and in the Hellenistic world, in the Greek world as well. And this is what she writes here. She says here, quoting her commentary on this section, she calls it Kohelet's memoir. She says, he seems to be adopting an Egyptian literary form, the grave biography, which in Hellenistic times had already been in use for 2,000 years. She goes on, the grave biography was a posthumous statement written in the name of a ruler or some other prominent person and recorded on the walls of the tomb or the funerary monument. It had three elements, all of which are present in Kohelet's memoir. First, a recitation of accomplishments. I made this, I did this. Secondly, a collection of ethical maxims that had guided the deceased through an exemplary life. We see that there, right? And exhortations to visitors to reflect on their own death and life accordingly. That's what Kohelet's doing. He's really, I've mentioned, I don't know, maybe I haven't mentioned it yet, but David Gibson has a book, Living Life Backwards. This whole book is written from the perspective of death, trying to give wisdom for those who are still living. And so this fits really well. She goes on, the aim of these biographies, these grave biographies, was twofold. First, to perpetuate the memory of the dead among the living. And secondly, and also to make a case before the gods for admission to a happy afterlife. And then she notes later here, the book of Ecclesiastes carries throughout, quote, the scent of the grave, end quote. It's that death perspective. Yet there is an irony in Kohelet's use of this literary form. Whereas the Egyptian grave biographies testified, truly or falsely, she notes parenthetically, to successful lives. Okay, so, you go into the tomb, there's this testimony to look at all the great stuff I did. It all worked out well for me. Kohelet produces a poignant admission of failure. This is a contrast between the literary genre found in the Hellenistic and Egyptian world. Here, Kohelet's not bragging. He's acknowledging failure. She goes on, the fiction that this is a royal memoir underscores the remarkable humility with which Kohelet speaks. So Martin Luther observes that this, quote, politics of Solomon, end quote, stands as a hedge against moral arrogance that should be daily consulted by all who hold any degree of authority at home or in business as well as in public office. So one of the things going on here is this ancient literary form known as the grave biography or an autobiographical memoir. And what is happening is you could take this as somebody kind of writing from the grave, saying, here's my perspective, here's what I've learned, warning those who come after. And of course, in the sermon, if you listen to the sermon, I encourage you to do so, you will see that I developed this whole point about this quest, this search for meaning in life, and how he went to these various places. He went to education, right? Credentialism, knowledge and wisdom, didn't find it there. He went then to the area of pleasure and satisfying the flesh, right? In a variety of ways, through food, through sex, through all these things, through acquisition, and just kind of enjoying the good life, and didn't find meaning there. Then went to the area of wealth and the accumulation of wealth, and did not find meaning there. And now there's this retrospect of the grave, of looking back, trying to tell us, you're not going to find meaning in those places if you look for meaning in those places. He's not denouncing those things. I think it's very important. I tried to make this distinction in my sermon. I'm not sure how successful I was, but the point is not that these things are bad, that you should be ignorant, have no fun in life, and be poor. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, if you make these things, all there is, if you look to them for meaning in your life, you will turn up empty. They will not deliver on their promises. But if you enjoy them all in connection with God, giving thanks to God, looking to God, rejoicing in God, recognizing that God has given these things for us to enjoy, and find your meaning in the giver instead of the gift, then you can come to these things and enjoy them and embrace them, and even find a level of meaningfulness in their enjoyment when you are giving thanks to God. Do all that you do to the glory of God, giving thanks to Him, as I quoted from Colossians 3:17 at the end of the sermon. So that's just a little bit more background. That is your sermon snack for the day. We're looking at a document here written by someone taking on the persona of Solomon, probably not Solomon himself, and writing this kind of literary genre that would have been extant in Egypt, ancient Egypt, and in the Hellenistic world, kind of writing us this thing that we might find in a tomb, in a gravesite, saying, here's my wisdom to you. Here's how to live life well. That's what this whole book is about, how to live life well. And so I hope that you will live a good life, the real good life, and that is a life that is joined in faith with God, who is the giver of all good gifts. Thanks for tuning in. God bless. Have a great day.